Linden.
Thank you very much, Sir Edward. It is, as always, a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and in doing so can also pay tribute to my friend from Lanark and Hamilton East for securing and opening the debate. I think it's actually quite fitting that we should be having a debate like this today of all days, when the Right Honourable Lady from South West Norfolk has just been appointed as Prime Minister. Not least because, if the rumours are to be believed, the Right Honourable Member for Spelthorne will be her Chancellor. And even more worryingly, the Right Honourable Gentleman from North East Somerset is said to be the Secretary of State for Business, which I think, if most of us thought this was the 1st of April, we probably wouldn't take it serious. But part of the reason why I think it's appropriate is because the Right Honourable Lady, our new Prime Minister, and the new Chancellor offered a book back in 2012 called Britannia Unchained. Now, I don't know if the Minister has read the book. Unfortunately, I've read all of it, and it's pretty grim reading. But the book asserts that the UK has a bloated state, high taxes and excessive regulation. It then says that the British are among the worst idlers in the world. We work among the lowest hours, we retire early, and our productivity is poor. Whereas Indian children aspire to be doctors or businessmen, the British are more interested in football and pop music. So when writing about employment legislation and regulations, that is the view of our current Prime Minister and soon-to-be Chancellor. And I think that, for me, highlights why it's so important that employment legislation is devolved to the Scottish Parliament, because the idea that you would have Conservatives continuing to be in control of employment legislation really is akin to leaving a lion in charge of an abattoir. And of course, when you look at the Conservative Party's record on employment legislation, let's take, for example, the Anti-Trade Union Act. Now, the irony would not have been lost on most of us yesterday that one of the clauses within the 2016 Trade Union Act that required a certain threshold to be met in order that workers could withdraw their labour, that very threshold wasn't even achieved by the Prime Minister yesterday when she was elected as leader of the Conservative Party. So there is very much a case here that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. My honourable friends from East Dunbartonshire and Lanark and Hamilton East have already touched on the fact that there's been no employment bill. But the whole reason that we were promised an employment bill was because after the Brexit referendum, we were told that Brexit was about improving workers' rights, it was about improving environmental standards. I think the only thing that's happened in connection to any of those is we're pumping raw sewage now out to seas. So I think that gives you a fairly clear indication about where the government plans to go if it brings forward an employment bill, because I don't think it will be to strengthen workers' rights. My honourable friend, the member for Paisley and Renfrewshire North, has already done a ton of campaigning on fire and rehire legislation, which shamefully the government talked out when the bill came forward as a private member's bill. We've seen little action when it comes to P&O ferries and the shocking treatment of their staff, including one of my own constituents. My honourable friend from Lanark and Hamilton East has been doggedly pursuing the government on her campaign for paid miscarriage leave, something that I think anybody with even an ounce of compassion in their hearts, and the Conservative Party like to talk about being compassionate Conservatives, the idea that that has not been legislated for, I'd love to know what the government's objection is to introducing paid miscarriage leave that my honourable friend has fought so valiantly to try and get in the statute book. But all of this, Sir Edward, stands in contrast to the efforts, albeit the very limited efforts, that the Scottish Government can do in terms of employment. Contrast that, for example, to the Scottish Government, which sees trade unions very much as partners, not opponents. We see them as being people who are rightly there to stand up for workers' rights. I myself am very proud to be a member of the Unite Trade Union. But the Scottish Government has this view that trade unions should not be seen as the enemy, whereas the government constantly sees trade unions as being some sort of opportunity to play kind of political football with. The idea that, you know, the Right Honourable Gentleman from Welland Hatfield, and I think he was revelling in every single moment in his dispute with the RMT just recently, because he saw that as an opportunity to advance his career. By all accounts, probably not going to do him very good today. But you know, the Scottish Government already has a number of policies which I think give a clear indication of the direction of travel about where we would go in terms of supporting workers. We've got a clear opposition to zero-hours contracts, what I would call exploitative zero-hours contracts. We've got the Scottish Government's business pledge, which has been refreshed. We've got a commitment to the living wage, not the pretend living wage that the UK government talks about, but the living wage that's actually in line with the Living Wage Foundation and the real cost of living. We fund the Scottish Trade Union Congress with the trade union, the Scottish Trade Union Learning Cash. So I think that the devolution of employment law, of course, is supported by the Scottish Trade Union Congress. Now, I will wait with great interest to hear from the Honourable Gentleman from Edinburgh South about why it is that the Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party, opposes the Scottish Trade Union Congress and their calls for devolution of employment law. Labour Party, I understand, considers itself to be the party of devolution, so why on earth do they oppose both the people of Scotland and indeed the Scottish Trade Union Congress when it comes to devolution of employment law? But I think that there is a lot more that I would like to see done if we could manage to devolve employment law. It's quite clear that the UK government are not going to bring forward an employment bill that is going to adequately improve workers' rights. But there are a couple of things that I think I would like to see us look at. For example, I think we have to have a very honest conversation, particularly in this place, about the use of unpaid internships. It is something that is absolutely rife in this place. Far too many people, presumably even some in my own party, exploit young people from working class communities by asking them to come down here and do unpaid internships. And I think that's something that all of us collectively have got to grapple with. And I'd certainly like to see a complete ban on unpaid internships and unpaid trial shifts. I'd like to see us look at things like the 4-day week. We have just gone through a global pandemic where the whole nature and world of work has changed enormously. Yet there are a number of things that we could do as a result of learning from the pandemic. A 4-day week would be just one of them. And of course, I want to see us deliver proper enforcement for national minimum wage legislation. We've had national minimum wage legislation and statutes since 1997, but there have been some years since 1997 where the number of prosecutions have been in single figures, if at all. So I think that there is so much more that we could do with the devolution of employment powers. But I want to go back just in rounding off my speech to talk about that theme that I started with, which is the book that our current Prime Minister's entire political philosophy is based on, Britannia Unchained. The reality is that for so long as Scotland remains chained to this failing union and this disgusting Conservative government, then I'm afraid we're going to see more policies like this. So yes, by all means we can call on the devolution of employment law, but we could actually do something much better and unchain ourselves from this place with the powers of independence.